Hey everyone, it's Andre Luck here to share my video for this week where I'm going to kick off a new series where I'm going to talk about being an introvert in sales. So something that I'm very familiar with, passionate about, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there, both for extroverts and introverts. So over the next 4 weeks here in the month of May, what I'm going to talk through are 4 different topics. So today's will be more of a high-level overview of being an introvert, an extrovert, and some of the strengths and weaknesses that come with that in sales. Then the next week, I'll talk about being an introverted sales manager. The week after that would be if you're a manager managing introverted sellers. And then the last week will be around extroverts and introverts in sales and how we work together to have a successful team and a successful unit. So, as I said, this is something I have a lot of experience in, a lot of thoughts just from my time in sales. Being introverted is definitely led to some misunderstandings for me and other introverted sellers, but then also some blessings that come from it too, just the personality type and things like that. And what really sparked the idea for me was there's a content creator that I listen to. Her name's Nikki Saunders, and she talks a lot about personal branding and creating content. And from her content I've watched over the years, I would assume she was an extrovert because she's very passionate, outgoing, but she said she's super introverted. And she gets a lot of her energy just kind of being alone by herself. And one thing she's really leaned into recently is creating content for introverts or helping introverts create content that's genuine and authentic to them so that they can stand out and not feeling like they have to fit into a mold or things like that. So, she's really leaning into that and motivating and inspiring content creators that are introverted. And, I hope to do the same for sellers, specifically those in sports, because there seems to be a expectation and misconception that you need to be extroverted to have success. So first we'll just start, high level definitions like where does it come from? Where does your personality come from? And just from research that I've done, about 50% of it's genetics. The rest is just through your life experiences and events that have happened that kind of shape who you are. And really a lot of people look at it as like, what gives you energy? What fuels your energy? Introverts get recharged and get their energy back from kind of being alone and being introspective in their thoughts, where extroverts like to be around people and like to be in social environments. And it's so interesting to watch because my wife and I are polar opposites. I'm highly introverted, she's highly extroverted. Sometimes that comes up and leads to friction and tension in our relationship, but it's also interesting to see the dynamic of our kids too, because we have 3 of them. And I would say one is extremely introvert like me, one is extremely extrovert like my wife, and one's kind of in the middle and flexes between both, but you'd call an ambivert. So I went to the Webster's definition just to get deeper into it and understand, like, all right, what is the definition of each? So what Webster says, definition of an introvert is someone who's typically reserved or a quiet person who tends to be introspective and enjoys spending time alone, while an extrovert is someone who's typically gregarious and unreserved, who enjoys and seeks out social interaction. So kind of what I talked about, the differences, the parallels between my wife and I. And then an ambivert is a person who has both characteristics. So depending on the situation, they kind of flex between both. And I think based on that definition is where a lot of the misconceptions come. When you think about sales and you think about, engaging people and being persuasive and convincing, kind of the old school methodologies around like what makes a good salesperson, that's where I think a lot of it comes down to, well, like extroverted people, they're outgoing, they seek social engagement. Like sales is about social interaction, where an introvert, if they're reserved and they like spending time alone, you may assume that person doesn't do well at sales. But I have some data that shows favors in all different directions. It's really depending on how you use your strengths and your personality type to your advantage. But we'll touch on that here in a little bit. So, but one of the big misconceptions that whether people intentionally share it or it just kind of comes out because that's just what we've been conditioned to think, is that extroverts are really good at sales and introverts, they're going to struggle at sales. And there are different parts of the sales process where you may need to be aware of your personality type and either flex up or pull back a little bit because of how buyers make decisions and how you can engage and build relationships with your prospects and clients. So extroverts, because they're outgoing, because they're social, they could build a connection very quickly. So they're probably really good early in the sales process, prospecting, outreach, outbound, quickly building relationships. Where introverts, they're better building rapport. It takes a little more time to build a relationship, but they're really good in like high complex, strategic, consultative type sales. As I think back as my time, like full-time selling, that's where I lean more towards, and probably why even more so now, I lean more into the B2B sales process because it's consultative, it's strategic. I very quickly got uncomfortable and got over having the conversation where it was like very impulse decisions, emotional, talking to fans and families, like really trying to engage them. Like that just didn't seem authentic to me. At the time, I was just like, man, maybe I'm just not good at sales. But where I thrived and did better was more in the relationship type sales, group sales processes, renewing and building relationships with season ticket holders and group buyers, businesses, because that is a consultative sale. You have to have a level of confidence. You have to put yourself out there because you're talking to a business person. But when you're in there, it's about listening, it's about consultating, and asking good questions, which introverts do really well. But a lot of the misconceptions come because historically sales was about giving information. You had to be persuasive, you had to be convincing. There wasn't information readily available for prospects and clients, so it had to come from the salesperson. And the way you deliver that message and the more energy, you probably had more success. Where now modern buyers and modern sellers need to adjust, because that's not the case anymore. Because there's so much information out there, modern buyers are coming to the sales process 80+% of the way through the process. So if someone already has all the information, you're coming at them, giving them more information, you're going to rub them the wrong way. Where now you need to meet them where they are. And what people prefer now, specifically in B2B sales, they want someone they can trust. They want someone that's genuine and authentic. They want someone that's going to personalize their solutions. So if you're just talking and not listening, then you're not gonna thrive. So there's different skills needed, and which, if you're an extrovert or an introvert, you can do, but you just need to be aware of what those skills are and what's necessary to have success in modern selling, specifically B2B. So being able to listen, being able to ask questions, being able to build long-term relationships, those are things that come a little more naturally to introverts and ambiverts. So they typically have more success in those type of situations. So looking at some of the data and look at some of the stats I pulled up, there was a Wharton School study. It's a little outdated, probably about 10 years old, so need to find something probably a little more current. I'm sure there's stats out there, but what they found is neither introverts or pure introverts or extroverts are the top sellers. It's typically the ambiverts. They sell 24% more than a pure introvert or pure extroverts, because they have a blend of being able to talk and have conversation, but also listening depending on the situation. So for those of you that are a mix of the two, that's what has led to most success for salespeople, because there are points in the sales process where you do have to be a little more out there. You do have to be more outgoing. Other times where you got to, pull back and listen, which is typically more natural tendencies of an introvert. What they also found in that study is that extreme introverts, so those people that, high energy, in your face, they often sold worse than the moderate extroverts. So, some people that are extroverted, you're out there, like you're really out there, and you have to be aware of how that comes off to people. Because if you're just talking at people all the time and like really trying to push products and things like that from a sales perspective, you can struggle. Whereas if you're moderately extroverted, where in the right times and right situations, you're putting it out there, and getting people excited and energetic, you could have more success. Also, what they found is the top performing salespeople, they talked 43% of the time, or they listened 57% of the time. So again, tendencies that come a little more natural for introverts, ambiverts, because naturally we just are listeners and we want to, understand before we speak. We think before we speak, where extroverts, they just speak and they don't think. And then the last stat that I found is 96% of buyers say they want sellers that actively listen and understand their needs before pitching solutions. So not to say that you can't do that as an extrovert. It's just these are things that maybe naturally come a little more natural if you're an introvert or an ambivert. So again, I think the natural misconception or the perception of what a salesperson should look like and what it should sound like, and if you're not very thoughtful as you're bringing on salespeople or thinking what makes a good salesperson, you're gonna default to some of those tendencies. And as I can look back on my times hiring, you'd meet people and they'd be just through the roof, like excited, energetic, like they make people feel good. And you're like, all right, this person's going to do well at sales, because that's what sales is about. But when you really think about what sales is about, back and forth listening, as I got more mature in my hiring, I could pull out some of those things. Maybe it was because I was a little more in tune and a little more perceptive, because I just do by personality type. But as I dive deeper into, the one-on-one sessions and getting to know people and how they thought and went about making decisions, I could find probably better than others, like, oh, this is actually a skill that's going to help them. I didn't know how to clearly articulate that and define it, but there was something in there. And I think it's that ability to think strategically, to ask good questions, to have good conversation, and get people talking, and not jumping in all the time and letting them speak, that I think found some of those diamonds in the rough at times in salespeople, that naturally, early on, if they answer questions, or, they present in front of the group, you're like, oh, that person's not going to be good at sales. But there are other parts than just, being outgoing and being energetic and things like that. So at the end of the day, for me, it's not an absolute one way or the other. I think it's not, all right, ambiverts are always going to sell more, or introverts aren't going to sell more, whatever it is. I think, these are skills that could be learned. Like, coming from someone who has a growth mindset, like, you're not fixed in what your personality is. It's just being aware of what it is and knowing the different dynamics, and then taking a step further, knowing maybe the personalities of the people that you're working with, and understanding, all right, this person, the way they receive information, or the way that they want to talk a lot, like, let's let them talk, and understand the personality types of the people that you're working with also. And just being aware of your strengths and weaknesses, and how that could help you or how that could hurt you in certain situations. The last thing I'll say is, I'll tell a quick story from my time selling, or my time as a manager, early manager. We would do these personality assessments as a leadership team, so we would know, what are we good at, what are our strengths, what are some of our weaknesses, and we'd read through these personality types. And one of the things that I actually did this as a salesperson too, and it really helped us just identify, us, understand ourselves better. And I think that was one of the things that, really grew me personally in my career. But when we get the assessment back, most of my teammates, it was gregarious, it was outgoing, connects well with people, brings people together. And then you read mine, it was, pretty much definition of an introvert, enjoys quiet time alone, can do, methodical tasks, and like needs space and room to breathe pretty much. And they called me Steady Eddie. And, I used to get upset, but over time, I realized that was a superpower. So just immature on my part to get upset about that. But same when I became a manager, we do the same thing. Same type of group of people, actually some of the same people that I was with as a seller. We went on to different roles as leaders together. Same thing. Most of the people in the room, outgoing, demanding, commanding, brings groups together. And then mine was, pretty much the same thing. Can do repetitive tasks. We'll set up a good structure. Very methodical in his processes. Needs time and space to consume information. And I tried to fight it. I'm like, no, that's not me. I can, be different. I'm gonna be different. And it didn't work, because at the end of the day, like, that isn't my strength. That wasn't who I was. So the more I, studied that and leaned into, I remember there was an assessment I took, and it came with like a free coaching consultation with it. And this guy's, very, like, he's professional and like reading these assessments and reading people. And he was asking me, what's your profession? I said, I'm a director of sales. And he's like, huh, interesting. I was kind of taken aback. And he's like, be aware of that. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, your personality type reads someone who, in those situations, that could be very stressful. And that over time, if you're not careful, can weigh on you. So, and there are definitely situations I look back and like really reflect where it did, and I needed to give myself space. And where I felt most recharged and energized was when I would take an hour to just go get away, get out of the office, and like go up to a suite and just catch up on work, or over the weekend when it's quiet, when the family's out of town or something like that. Like, I could just catch up on things. Like, that was where a lot of the energy came from, and I was recharged. So I think it's just knowing who you are, and knowing your strengths and weaknesses and things like that, and how do you leverage that to your strengths, so you have success. So next week, I'll talk about being an introverted sales manager. So I touched on it a little bit, but what it's like as an introverted sales manager, how you can use that as a strength, how you can use that as a superpower differentiator from a majority of other managers who maybe are a little more extroverted, because that's just naturally, people who get into sales and they move up throughout their career. So I'm really excited about this series. Would love to get feedback and hear as we go through that. And if you have thoughts and opinions, definitely share it. But I'll be back next week with another video. Thanks.